ننتقل إلى الجلسة الثانية لليوم، ورئيس الجلسة طبعا بعنوان الزلزال. رئيس الجلسة على سيرة زلزال امبارح أو عفوا الزلازل، السيد شكيب أبوزيد يترأس الجلسة، وهو الأمين عام الاتحاد العام العربي للتأمين GAIF، والمتحدث الأول سيد حسن نصر نائب الرئيس في ناسكو لبنان، والمتحدث أيضا الدكتور محمد زولفغاري مدير كاتريسك سولوشن LTD. فليتفضلوا إلى الستيج.
صباح الخير عليكم. في الجلسة الحالية أو الجلسة الثانية هي بخصوص موضوع الزلازل. بطبيعة الحال كنا احنا بنسمع كثير عن الزلازل وعلى المناطق اللي فيها زلازل إلى آخره. مع الأسف الشديد أنه الزلزال الأخير اللي حدث بسوريا واللي حدث بتركيا أعاد إلى الإذهان على أنه خطر الزلازل هو خطر كبير جدا، ويتهدد بيتهدد العديد من البلدان العربية. احنا في الأردن هنايا اليوم في منطقة زلازل، في لبنان منطقة زلازل، في فلسطين كمان منطقة زلازل، لأن فيه شق بيمر عبر هذه البلدان، وهذا بيشكل خطر على البلدان هذه. في شمال إفريقيا في منطقة أو في خط طويل زلازل بيمتد من شمال غرب تونس إلى أكادير بالمغرب، وفي 1960 صار فيه زلزال كبير في المغرب ودمر مدينة أكادير. في الجزائر في زلازل كبيرة، الأصنام هدمت مرتين، 1954 و 1980 إذا ما خانش الذاكرة. كمان كان في زلزال كبير من بعد في 1992 كان في زلزال في مدينة القاهرة، وكان زلزال كبير كمان. مدينة الحسيمة في المغرب كمان من كذا سنة صارت فيها مرة أو مرتين صارت فيها زلازل. فخطر الزلازل خطر حقيقي، ولكن للأسف احنا ما بنعتنيش به بما فيه الكفاية. قبل شوية تكلمت على أنه لما بنتكلم عن الشمول المالي، الشمول المالي شو بيعني؟ الشمول المالي يعني أنه احنا كشركات تأمين ما فينا أنه نضل بنشتغل على منطق السابق. You have the translator, the translation. Sorry. في السابق كنا بنتعاطى التأمين أو بنتعامل مع التأمين على أنه والله مجموعة من اللاينز اوف بزنس، وكلنا بنعمل سيارات وبنعمل حياة وبنعمل الميديكال إلى آخره. لكن الآن بتصور أنه باعتقادي أنه في ضرورة لتغيير طريقة التفكير لدينا احنا كناس في التأمين. وأنا صراحة يمكن في الفترة في ال4 سنين الأخيرة اكتشفت بالخصوص مع مجيء الاتحاد العام العربي للتأمين على أنه احنا واجبنا أو الواجب المواطنين تاعنا كمواطنين أول شيء هو خدمة المواطنين، لأنه أربحت شركاتنا أو ربحوا المساهمين تاعنا، هذا شيء ممتاز جدا، وهذه شيء معناتها اللي هو عادي جدا بالنسبة للمؤسسات الرأسمالية. لكن في آخر المطاف صناعة التأمين في حد ذاتها شو هو دور المواطن اللي يمكن تلعبه؟ بتصور وبيتخيل لي، وإحنا عملنا كتابات في هذا الموضوع في الاتحاد العام العربي للتأمين في مجلة الاتحاد اللي هي التأمين العربي، عن مسألة الشمول المالي، عن الكوارث الطبيعية، عن نماذج كذا 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 كذا. اليوم احنا كشركات تأمين يجب علينا إعادة النظر في المفاهيم نتاعنا. الجلسة الأولى كانت مهمة جدا لأنها كانت تتكلم على موضوع حساس في العديد من البلدان، المغرب، الجزائر، تونس، شمال ليبيا، مصر، الأردن، سوريا، العراق، كلهم هذه بلدان زراعية. وهذه البلدان الزراعية لما بنسأل أو بنشوف شو هي إحصائيات التأمين الزراعي فيها كلوز تو نيل. إذا استثنينا المغرب اللي فيه شوية لأن فيه سكيم، في ناشونال سكيم ما فيه. بالنسبة للزلازل التجارب اللي موجودة عندنا في المنطقة العربية معروفة ومحدودة لحد الآن. في تجربة في المغرب ابتدت من 3 سنين اللي هي تتمثل في صندوق الحد من مخاطر الكوارث الطبيعية الفسيك سوليداريتي فوند، وفيه صندوق ثاني بتديره شركة كات المغربية لكل شركات التأمين في المغرب اللي هو بول، اللي هو للناس المؤمن لهم. في الجزائر فيه نظام كمان للكوارث الطبيعية من زمان. تونس الآن بيحاولوا يشتغلوا على أنهم يكون عندهم نوع من البولينج أو نوع من الشغل أو نوع من مشروع في هذا الاتجاه. مصر كمان بتحاول بتشتغل على هذا الموضوع، بس بعيدة كل البعد أو لسه بعيدة على أنه تحقق شيء. إذا تكلمنا مثلا عن كوارث أخرى، عمان عاشت في خلال 15 سنة 3 أعاصير كبيرة جدا، جونو، ميكونو، وآخر واحد شاهين. احنا بنحكي على مليارات دولارات نتاع خسائر وخسائر في الأرواح إلى آخره، لكن شوفي في المقابل كتغطيات ولا حاجة ما في شيء تقريبا إلى آخره. أنا قبل ما بعطي الكلمة للدكتور محمد ولصديقي حسن ناصر، بس عندي تقديم بسيط بس باش نحطوا الموضوع بمعلومات شويه تكون اساسيه. هذا كيف بيمشي؟ اذا بتشوفوا في هذه الارقام نتاع الكوارث الطبيعيه مثلا من 2002 ل 2021 وفي 2022، فاذا بتلاحظوا على أنه الكوارث اللي صارت في 2022 387 كارثة. هذو الإحصائيات اللي بنجيبوهم من سويسري من أيون إلى آخره. شو هم الكوارث اللي صارت في 2022؟ الجفاف 22، الزلازل 31، اكستريم تمبيراتشر 12، الفيضانات 176 عدد الفيضانات، هذا انزلاق التربة لاند سلايد 17، الماس موفمنت دراي ما صار فيه شيء، العواصف 108، الفولكانيك اكتيفيتي ما بشوف الرقم تما يمكن 5 او شيء، والوايلد فاير اللي حرائق الغابات 15. اخوان في الجزائر كان صارت عندهم حرائق في 2022 2021، لبنان صار فيها حرائق في الغابات، المغرب كذلك الى اخره. ف شو المعلومات اللي عندنا؟ اذا لاحظنا الارقام في ال10 سنوات الأخيرة أكثر من 700 ألف شخص ماتوا بفعل الكوارث الطبيعية أو بسبب الكوارث الطبيعية، والجرحى 1,400,000، و23 مليون شخص اضطروا للنزوح من محلاتهم. ف 1,500,000,000 شخص تأثروا بالكوارث الطبيعية حسب منظمة الأمم المتحدة. إذا أخذنا سنة 22 لحالها الخسائر الاقتصادية كانت 284 مليون، 275 مليون بفعل كوارث طبيعية، و9 ملايين اللي هي الكوارث اللي هي بتسمى المان ميد اللي هي بيتسبب فيها الإنسان. هذه حسب تقرير سيجما الأخير نتاع 23. فقط في 2022 الكوارث الطبيعية اللي بسبب المخاطر الطبيعية 125 مليار دولار. مع العلم أنه insured losses due to natural disaster amounted US dollar 125 مليار from insured losses amounted to 132 مليار حسب دائما سيجما ريبورت. بس في الربع الأول من 23 الايكونوميك لوسز كانوا الأعلى من سنة 2011. الببليك اند برايفت انشورنس انتيتيز غطوا 22 مليار في الكل. البروتكشن جاب اللي هو الفارق ما بين شو اسمهم الايكونوميك لوسز والانشورد لوسز بعده 72%. الايكونوميك لوسز كما بتشوفوا على اليمين الشاشه 77 مليار دولار، الانشورد 22 مليار. معناتها هون تكمن الكارثه. دائما الكوارث اللي بتصير كلها بتكون غير مغطاة. افريقيا يظهر لي ما ضروري نحكيو فيها كثير، الزلازل ما كاينه كثير في افريقيا، بس كاين خطر الفيضانات. الدول العربيه، في الدول العربيه من 1980 متوسط الكوارث الطبيعيه تضاعف 3 مرات. في 30 سنه الاخيره صارت عندنا 270 كارثه في المنطقه العربيه، قتلت اكثر من 150 الف شخص و10 مليون تاع الاشخاص انجرحوا. هذا شو بسمي هذا التيبل ممتازه جدا، لان بتعطينا شو بسميه الريسك اندكس. الريسك اندكس في شيء اسمه الورد ريسك ريبورت، وانا بتمنى على كل الناس انه تقراه. هذا بتعمله رور يونيفرسيتي، هذه جامعه المانيه. اكثر بلد عنده الريسك اندكس نتاعو مرتفع هو الفلبين. الاندكس نتاعهم 46%. هذا الاندكس بينعمل بناء على معطيات عديده جدا. مثل ما بتشوفوا مثلا البلدان اللي بالاحمر معناتها ان الاندكس ريسك نتاعها مرتفع جدا. الجزائر 9.58%، في مصر 20.65%، المغرب 10.29%، عمان 7.27 الى اخره الى اخره. بس اسوأ شيء للاسف هو اليمن 24.26. الاندكس الديفينيشن تاعه موجوده عند الورد ريبورت. مفروض هذه هي الديفينيشن تاع الكونسبت. شو بياخذ الاكسبوجر اول شيء، وبياخذ الفولنربيليتي، بيشوف الانتنسيتي ليفل، الايرثكويكس، التسوناميز، سايكلونز، الكوستال فلودينجز الى اخره، والجفاف. فالاكسبوجر، وبعدين بيشوف الفولنربيليتي. اذا الدكتور محمد كان اكسبلين بيتر ذان مي ذس، والسيسيبيليتي. هذا الاندكس على الاقل بيعطينا فكره على اننا احنا عايشين في منطقه خطيره جدا. هادو في المنطقه العربيه اهم الكوارث الطبيعيه اللي صارت، حكيت عنها قبل شويه، موجوده بالتفصيل نتاعها. فاحنا مثلا عندنا مجموعه من المبادرات على صعيد المنطقه العربيه. في المغرب عندنا المبادره اللي تكلمت عنها، او الحلول التامينيه بالنسبه لتامين المخاطر الزراعيه وتامين خطر الزلازل او الكوارث الطبيعيه. في الجزائر في كمان نظام مثل ما قلت. عمان الان بيحاولوا انه يكون عندهم ايمرجنسي فاند، وفي تونس بيحاولوا يدرسوا الموضوع او بيدرسوا الموضوع الان. الحلول احنا كاتحاد عام عربي للتامين اطلقنا مبادره في 2 اكتوبر 2022 اللي هي بكل بساطه بول. ويظهر لي عدد من الناس حاضرين هنايا كانوا حاضرين معنا، ونحن لازلنا مصرين على انه اذا راح كل بلد على حاله وحاول انه يشتري اعاده تامين ممكن له، بس اذا راح، ولكن ستكون بكلفه. بس اذا رحنا كبلدان مجتمعه في بول بيمكن نلقاو حلول. مثلا في خصائص مشتركه بين المغرب والجزائر وتونس مثلا والاردن، ليش لا؟ او في خصائص مشتركه بين الاردن وسوريا ولبنان وفلسطين، ليش هاد البلدان هادو على الاقل 3 4 بلدان ما بيحاولوا يكون عندهم سولوشن مثل البول او شيء من القبيل؟ هذا غادي يتكلم عنه حسن احسن مني بعد شويه. قبل ما بحيل الكلمه على الزملاء بدي اعطيكم نبذه عن حياتهم. أول شيء دكتور محمد. ويلكم دكتور محمد. دكتور محمد is an earthquake scientist, graduated in 1995 from Imperial College of London. Dr. Mohammad has more than 30 years experience in natural catastrophes. Dr. Mohammad has supervised more than 45 PhD and master research with over 110 publications in scientific journal and conference. هذا فيما يخص الجانب سيانتيفيك، الجانب العلمي. بالنسبة للجانب العملي معنا حسن ناصر. حسن ناصر أنا بعرفه يمكن مش 25 سنة أو 30 سنة. حسن ناصر عنده 30 سنة في التأمين وإعادة التأمين. هو اشتغل أساساً في السعودية إذا ما خانتني الذاكرة، في فرنسا، في لبنان، وساعد في العديد من الشركات فيما يخص دير تريتي شو بسميهم أنا ارانجمنت والاشياء هذه. فبدون تاخير بحيل الكلمه لحسن ناصر. دكتور you want to speak the first or حسن؟ دكتور خلاص. The floor is yours, Dr. Mohammad.
Thanks. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. This is my first time in this conference and in Aqaba, in fact, and I would like to thank Jordan Insurance Federation and Nasco for inviting me to this conference. I'm a civil engineer by training, and then into earthquake engineering, kind of more on the scientific background on natural catastrophe and application to insurance. I don't know if I have my, yeah, okay. Okay, I start and then the slides come. I think when we're dealing with property insurance, and it's been kind of the concern for insurance company for so many years, maybe centuries, but the more traditional cover is fire. And even nowadays, when we're talking about property insurance, probably it starts from the fire and then extend into other perils. When we're dealing with when we're dealing with sort of hazards like fire, and when we have basically a portfolio of a sort of large diversification, usually what happens, we have one event or maybe a few events every year happening here and there, and therefore the basic concept of sort of insurance, which is risk pricing, is coming from a kind of a statistical analysis on the okay. Is it moving me this? Yeah. Okay, okay. All right, great, yeah. Let's say we have we have 1,000 buildings, and then ones get under fire every year, and therefore, from a statistical approach, we could come with a risk pricing, which is basically one per mil or 1 in 1,000. And if you have an earthquake or another natural catastrophe, it might basically cut the entire exposure. Still, once in 1,000 years, when it comes to risk pricing, become 1 in 1,000, 1 per mil. But what becomes important here is actually the accumulation. And the accumulation is something, given that we have geographic correlation between events that could between portfolio that could cause, then it would be a different thing. And this is usually when we're dealing with natural catastrophe, is not just the risk pricing, it's actually the accumulation. Because even in some unregulated markets, say, for example, when they capture a big risk, a facultative risk, and usually they share it with consortiums, each one of those companies taking a part of that sort of share, and by regulatory, they are under the limits, so they could basically write a business. It's okay, again, for accidental damage like fire or other sort of accident with no geographic correlation. But as soon as there is a big event, then a few of those shares of consortium add together and become something that none of those insurance companies are capable of paying. And this is basically the kind of lack of proper regulation that exists in almost in all developing countries. And I believe to some extent it might exist even in Arab countries as well. So geologists for a long time, maybe for a century, from geology evidence, from other sort of field survey, have basically pointed out that plates are moving. And they have shown different sort of boundaries, different location. And it was up to quite recently, last 20 years, that with the help of satellite technology and GPS, scientists managed to put a measure next to that. So yes, in fact, plates are moving. And there are a measurement which basically each portion of that plate, say for example, the most famous one, North Anatolian Fault, or let's say the Anatolian Plate, moving 2.5 centimeters per year. Might not look that much, but assuming if you basically gather it accumulate it for, let's say, 100 years, become 2.5 meters. 200 years becomes something like half a meter. And that actually caused big events. So that's why in North Anatolia, every 15 to 20 years, we have 1.7 magnitude plus earthquake. And even in the last century alone, we could see that the entire fault, the entire 1,000-kilometer fault has been ruptured by different events. And quite amazingly, the gap, there is also a gap in recently for the last 15 years. They actually say there is a portion of that fault under the Marmara Sea. No one's seen it, basically, but there is actually a potential for large earthquake there. And you could say, not publicly, but Istanbul is actually on standby for the last 20 years, and it's actually on a high alert. And imagine that a big earthquake, 7 magnitudes plus earthquake happened in that region. Mega cities like Istanbul and many other provinces like Yaluva, like Izmit are going to basically caught by a big event there. And we could also see in the previous centuries, in 19th centuries, again, we have so many events actually capturing that fault, and it's quite evident. So we see that 2.5 centimeter displacement quite sort of clearly here. In some other region, it might not show, it might basically not be associated to some big events, but still we see that displacement. And these are the GPS measurements that scientists with the precise GPS equipment managed to actually calculate and see. And you could see that even if we add the historical event, not long, just 40 years event, you see that actually there is very good consistency between what we call it the plate boundaries and actually where the earthquake are happening. And you could see even the region of Dead Sea, which are basically many countries are exposed to that event, and even the East Anatolian fault and Zagros fault. And if you basically kind of summarizing them in some active belt, you see that there are a few belts, Dead Sea, the East Anatolian fault, Zagros, and Red Sea, and Macron, which are basically completely surrounding the peninsula. So you could say that the entire peninsula is kind of surrounded by big events and sorts of events. And the more sort of surprising is that population and let's say civilization, as one of the oldest civilizations in the world, decided to actually make their buildings, make their civilization along the same sort of faults. You could see many megacities with over 2 million population sitting exactly where the big events are and where the basically large earthquake could happen. And civil engineers have been basically, this is not a new technology. Seismic hazard assessment has been in the literature for at least last 60, 70 years. And this is purely for civil engineers in order to make some assessment of what the hazard is going to be and basically making themselves prepared to build building against those seismic hazards. And as you could see again, we see basically the same shape, the same seismic hazard area. Of course, some of those countries, you could say, being unfortunate, having sort of a recent event, for example, the event that happened in northwest Iran, Kermanshah earthquake, and created sort of a big sort of region of high seismic area as a result of those large earthquakes. And again, you could see, for example, in East Anatolian fault and what happened basically, the kind of damage area as a result of that earthquake. You could call those countries being unfortunate to having such big losses, but the fortunate position for countries not experiencing so much losses are actually the ignorance and the lack of awareness, not just in the authority, in the public sort of people as well. People don't recognize actually what the stage of the seismic hazard in those countries is going to be. And this is actually, you could say that in some countries that had more frequent events like Iran, Turkey, some other countries, those sort of repeatedly events has created some enhancement in design code and in preparation for building, which by definition, when you say that a civil engineer designed a building to stand earthquake, traditionally that is supposed to design to sort of save people, not the asset. And civil engineers have been sort of doing quite a good job by actually introducing from normal masonry building, introducing what we call it a structural design with the concrete and steel and other components, making a structure which could stand and could basically save the building. But even in a pure sort of civil engineering design and construction and sort of inspected the environment, the idea is to save the building as saving people, more with the social and humanitarian, basically, consequences, not necessarily saving economy and saving basically sort of money. So, and as a result, you could see that even in the recent events in Iran, assuming that buildings are built to stand and save life, but in terms of economic losses, it's total loss. Because what actually caused the losses is not just the structure, it's the non-structural element that when a building shakes, it could still stand, people could walk out of the building, not actually get caught inside the rubble, but in terms of the building itself, given that all non-structural element is going basically shaken and out, probably from economic point of view, you could call all those buildings total loss. Although they're standing and people could sort of save their life and a good achievement from civil engineering point of view, but from economic point of view, it's total loss. And we see that. That's why we say that even in the well-developed and sort of constructed and standard sort of nation that they managed to bring good design code, that was purely for saving life, not saving the asset. And it could say that even in developed country, when there is an earthquake, still people might get out of the building safely, but the structure could get under heavy damage because in a normal situation for a normal sort of residential building, almost 70 to 80% of the total construction cost is non-structural. Call it windows, ceiling, and so on, and that's basically what happened in those situations. So if you just take, I put this example of event in Iran, and as you could see, if you put just this statistic of damages that basically caused by the event, usually when an earthquake happens, I'm just talking about the earthquake, there will be a very small area being highly shaken by earthquake damage or earthquake intensity, but there will be much vaster region experiencing lower intensity and usually not actually putting the building under total construction sort of collapse. And if you look at the statistic, basically that's what we see. We usually see okay, it's not working, so maybe okay, it's moving. Okay. If you're looking basically at the statistic, you see that there are so many buildings being shaken slightly and still getting some non-structural damage, and a very small portion being total collapse. And okay, that part is going to be responsible for casualties and for basically social event. But these numbers are actually causing loss. In certain stages, we might basically be able, by introducing some measures, like some financial measures, okay, we might be able to actually reduce that number, like deductible and limit, but still there will be so many slightly shaken building, but in terms of non-structural damage, it's going to be basically what comes into insurance and basically become an insurance loss, insured loss. So how to deal with that? How to basically, let's say, statistically and scientifically deal with the losses coming from natural catastrophe? Of course, it's been an issue for sort of insurance industry for so many years. And what basically happened in the past, they're usually looking at the claim data or the historical data, or in some cases, you might find a scenario as a deterministic approach to apply the losses from that scenario to your portfolio, but that's not sufficient because although it might work For other perils, like for other line of businesses, like cars or auto or life or whatever, given that you have a very big sort of database of claims, for natural catastrophe it's not going to work because it's quite infrequent, and at the same time, the land use is going to change in time. So even if you have a good claim data for an event that happened 20 years or 50 years ago, the land has changed quite significantly. That is not going to be applicable today for that purpose. So what we do as a sort of natural catastrophe, and this is basically the approach. So by just taking some ways of recording the losses from historical earthquake, and as you could see, there has been so many companies basically being bankrupt as a result of big natural catastrophes that happened in history, and not long time ago in history, even back into 80s and 90s, that basically many basically buildings, many basically insurance companies got into this problem. So the scientific approach is to basically take in the science, the engineering, the science could be meteorology, seismology, geology, based on what peril we're going to take, sort of estimating the event, the damage, the intensity out of the image, taking the event and taking the exposure, assigning vulnerability function, and then calculating the losses in a more scientific way. So we call it catastrophe modeling technology, which has been in the market for so many years, for last, say, 20 or 30 years. And quite recently, some other initiative, open source initiative, opened the door for other research groups and other sort of smaller vendors in order to play in this business and bring the knowledge into the hands of insurance company. So what we do, we're looking at the geology, seismology, historical earthquake, and at the end, we come up with what we call it a stochastic event set. An event set which we suppose to present it for a much longer time than historical events. Say, if the historical event is for the last 20 years or last 100 years or maximum 1,000 years, we simulate an earthquake catalog, for example, in this case, which stands for 10,000 years or even 50,000 years. Each event has a magnitude, has a location. Then we basically apply each of those events on the exposure side and then calculate the damage coming from every event, or in a simple way, we're capturing all uncertainties with the events, with the intensity, with the damage, and as a result, once we calculate the damage, we have the damage distribution per every event, per every portfolio, and that's the point that you could precisely take into account policy conditions like deductible limit, and therefore moving from kind of economic losses to insured loss. And this statistic could work on all the events within the catalog and all the portfolios, all the sort of coverages within the portfolio. And then basically at the end, on top of that, we could also put the reinsurance conditions and come up with the losses to the reinsurance structure. We did basically, given that we don't have time, this is an example of losses for all the 1,000-year event that happened in Iran. So the size of those boxes are actually showing the economic losses, say, just from residential. Say the biggest one, for example, up to $15 to $30 billion losses just from residential losses. On the Dead Sea Fault, we see the historical event. This is the stochastic event catalog that we generated for this region. If we just take the market portfolio of, let's say, 22 billion Jordanian dinar, and then basically distributed all across the country, you could see that all the TRVs are actually, in fact, sitting along the Dead Sea Fault. If we're running a model, we could capture the economic losses, what we call it the annual mean losses. Again, we could see that there is a good consistency between where the faults are and basically the, 30 seconds, I'm going to finish here. This is again another example just showing the size of those events in terms of economic losses. That could be used for structuring some sort of parametric sort of business deal if we were basically just a first generation parametric deal, taking the magnitude and the box and the size of exposure that might happen basically. And there are other tools that you could use to basically capture different deductible limit and policy condition as basically making affordable solution for poor people living in the poor, sort of vulnerable places. And the challenges that I'm not going to read through, given that I don't have, the challenges that all the insurance companies are dealing in developing countries, and I suppose Hassan, my friend, is going to basically continue on that, and probably one of the things that in particular might be a solution to countries like countries in the region, the CAT pool, in order to make a PPP, private-public partnership for basically sharing the natural catastrophe between different parties. My apology if I sort of extend my time. Thank you for listening. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammad. We're looking to the maps. Really, it's scary, yeah? Especially, you know, the correlation between the seismic areas and the population or the concentration of the population. Just one question. The 22 billion is the expected maximum loss if there is an earthquake in Jordan?
That's the market value.
The market value, okay. But do you have an estimate for how much will be the highest or the maximum loss if there is an earthquake in Jordan?
Yes, we have done it. We don't have 100%, yes, but we have, I think with this technology, you could basically calculate all the statistics of losses at the different resolution. Yeah, we have done this calculation, and probably maybe Mr. Hassan is going to sort of, mention that,
Just, I think there is one main conclusion from your presentation is, in fact, I think it's necessity of modeling for all the markets. I think there is something we cannot avoid. This is number one, although the cost is very high. And number two, I think, is the seismic design. I think it must be mandatory.
Exactly.
Because what we have seen in Turkey, even after, you know, the earthquake of Izmit, or Izmit, huh?
Izmit,
yeah. Again, you know, last earthquake, we have seen many destroyed buildings. I think, especially in countries like Jordan, seismic design must be mandatory. Hassan, please.
Thank you.
You have 20 minutes, huh? I'm sorry, I will. Thank you.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to try to go fast because I only have 20 minutes or 25. And I'm going to build on what Mohammad and Chakib started on this one. So what we're going to do is try to build a little bit on the presentation that was done to see what this means for the insurance and the reinsurance industry. Practically in terms of numbers, in terms of practices, in terms of policy design, and the effect on the reinsurance and the possible pooling after going through some of the experiences of the countries around the region. We will take a few examples on the pools and how they thought about the different designs, because maybe we can concede altogether that not necessarily what happens in one country is the best for another, but the main concepts of pooling remain the same, from where we can start designing our own pools or ideas regarding how to cover the markets. Thank you. So this is some observation that Chakib actually already made recently. Due to whatever reasons, climate change or other reasons, we have seen that catastrophic events are actually increasing in frequency as well and in severity, both in terms of man-made and of natural perils, whereby natural disasters since 2017 quadrupled in numbers only. But I think the main observation that also was mentioned is that the gap between the total losses and the insured losses is consistently increasing, partly due of insurance penetration or low insurance penetration, and obviously what Mohammad mentioned is the further concentration of civilization around specifically the faults. This is an example of 5 of the top catastrophe or earthquake specifically in the world, whereby only 14% of the losses were actually insured. And here, mind you, we're talking about theoretically countries where insurance is much more evolved in our region and the penetration is much, much higher than ours. So I'm not going to go through this, but this is just to sensibilize that we are sitting in a very dangerous area in terms of earthquake. We cannot hide from this. Even if it didn't happen today in one of our cities, we are sitting, and we shouldn't wait for a drama to take place to act, because by that time it would be probably too late. Many, I would say at the end, of the pools actually happened specifically after an earthquake, and I think we need to be a little bit more proactive. A little bit about the regional earthquakes that took place recently in the last decade, where you can see the difference between the economic loss and the insured losses. In Syria, Turkey and Syria, obviously we still don't know the exact numbers, but we're talking approximately 100 billion economic loss with something around a maximum of 5 billion insured losses. This is not obviously good, because the insurance industry is here to try as much as possible to assist. In Kermanshah, we're talking about $5 billion of economic loss and almost no insurance really, at least not in percentages. That's worth mentioning. In Izmit, we're talking about 20 billion economic loss, 6.5 billion only property losses. So if we go to the property with only 2 billion that were insured. Secondary perils, tsunamis, if you just take a look at this slide, you see actually, including Aqaba, we are also prone for tsunamis. Many of the main cities that we know in the MENA region are part of this. United Nations actually did this study, and this is also a peril to look at and to be careful. Now, Mohammad went a lot into the probabilistic approach and what it means, and he also mentioned the deterministic. In our language, deterministic is when we take our PML, or the earthquake exposure, in terms of PML. The probabilistic, I think it was pretty much explained, but what does this mean for us really? For us, it means that we need to be careful about what earthquake means, about the data we collect, and about the different relationships in earthquakes. This is an example of one earthquake, which I can see in Sumatra. It happened in 2004, whereby it triggered a loss of over 2,500 kilometers. And as an example, I put at the end, Turkey to Jordan, we're talking half that distance only. So that's something that really should alert us a little bit about the possibilities that might take place. Because there is something called as a dynamic stress transfer, which actually means that one earthquake can trigger another earthquake, and we're not talking here about aftershocks. We're talking about actual earthquake in terms of the definition of an earthquake. I'm not gonna go through this one. A little bit about the parameters and the factors of our industry in terms of the modeling. This slide, it looks complicated, but it's not really. Let's take the deductible as an example. In this case, the curve in blue, it's a base scenario when, and these are real numbers for real models for real companies, by the way. If we take the exposure of a company, of a portfolio of a company, where we modeled it based on a zero deductible, this one which shows that approximately we should expect in a 1,000-year, $361 million of exposure. The same portfolio, when modeled with a 1% deductible, you can see more than a 10% decrease in the exposure of the company. And if we go up to 5%, that's 40% decrease in the exposure of the company. The frequency of the losses, when we introduce a deductible, which is a very important parameter in the direct policies, could really mean at one point in time a difference between the existence or the non-existence of an insurance company. This is a very important parameter. Now, if we add to it what we all know, I don't know all, most who work in the actual insurance industry in terms of reinsurance, the interlocking clause, which was recently introduced in the market after the Beirut explosion, this, at the same time, it means that the available capacity for reinsurance, the protection, actually shrank. At one point in time, just before the Beirut explosion, we used to deal on what we call underwriting year basis. In other words, every treaty for every year had an additional capacity for exposure, so we can stack them up one over the other. If we had 200 million for 2022 and 2023, an earthquake takes place, policies of 2022 and 2023 are not combined under the event limit. And therefore, we would have, in this case, we took an example of 400 million. In the interlocking clause, this shrinks the capacity, which means we could come to a point with all these combined, a lower deductible on the insurance policies, an interlocking clause where the company might not be covered enough. This is another example. I took two examples. This is about the portfolio composition. Whether we write more residential, more industrial, or more commercial, the mixed one, the blue one, is the normal portfolio that we could see. Whether practically it's one that comprises of residential, commercial, and industrial. As you can see, if a portfolio is 100% residential, we expect a higher exposure. As Mohammad mentioned, residential actually has more vulnerability, and I think also Chakib mentioned the word vulnerability in this sense. So the quality of the data that is provided is very essential, and the understanding of the portfolio, because the modeling, the more data we have that makes sense, should actually give us more accurate numbers about the exposure of the companies. I added over here also the two bars for the interlocking clause, which I think by now are self-explanatory. Skewness. Almost in every earthquake, there is always that one big or two big losses that skew the whole average. And now, in the last earthquake, we're talking about Iskandarun port, which numbers are not clear yet, but we're talking about maybe a $500 million loss out of the 3.5 to 5 billion. We could go 15 to 10% on one loss. That also is something where we need to be careful when studying our portfolio. Help? Okay. We learned this as well, not only from earthquakes, even from big disasters. In Lebanon, we had the same. What happens after the earthquake is completely different than when we think about it before the earthquake. The aftermath is very important. Everything is disrupted, which would change the whole way we do business. There is no shelter, raw material shortage, labor shortage, the disruption of healthcare, utilities, and logistics. The normal inflation becomes a superimposed inflation. Actually, the number of hikes in the prices at every level becomes intolerable at one point in time. That is assuming that we can find the services. And this is where pools actually, by being post or at least proactive, can really bring a big value in terms of preparation for such events. So that's my last, almost my last part. I think I'm on time. So market solutions. I'm not going to go through all these, but these are major ones, very well known for being pools that have actually done very well in terms of crisis, some of them, and some of them were not tested yet because they were done after, an event took place. This one, what's important about it, I think it is the private-public partnership that's created in California. But as you can see, it's also after a 1994 loss that took place and took over around 20 billion of total property damage. So this is not the economic loss, it's only the property damage. The New Zealand one, this has been probably praised as one of the most well-known, developed, and professional pools. And after an earthquake took place and the activity of this New Zealand pool, there was actually more capacity for them when they wanted to insure the next year because of the way they dealt with the claims, the efficiency, and the preparation that was done. And it can all go all the way on how to ensure the obligatory covers in the pool. I'm going to spend a little bit more time here, Eric, because we all know, I think, the French is probably closer to home. This is a different way of working in terms of covering the the natural peril, because here we're not talking about earthquake, it's a different peril, it's a windstorm mainly. So practically, CCR, which is a very well-known reinsurer, as you all know, has the backup of the government, the guarantee of the government for certain perils, which include natural perils. They reinsure the insurance companies in terms of a quota share, so practically they share the risk, and a stop loss at one point in time. And they have also what they call the state intervention threshold. Practically, it's a limit above which the state would intervene as well. And this limit is always set based on the reserves, two kind of reserves actually. It's equalization reserves and the natural catastrophe reserves. Up to now, this threshold has never been exceeded, but CCR did provide a lot of protection since its guarantee or the protection is being given to the market. I think this is today an interesting one given what happened recently. We're talking about the TCIP, the Turkish Catastrophe Insurance Pool. So this was established as well after the Izmit earthquake. Something, I think this is the third time I mentioned it, that we should not wait for this drama to take place. We've seen it around us, we are sitting on it, and we need to be a little bit more proactive. So this is for homeowners, and it's required by law. It's an obligation. However, there is no penalty if you don't do it, or at least there's no process of a penalty. But there are, as you can say, bottlenecks in the administration of the government in different places where at some point in time, you are requested to present this policy to make sure that you have it. Today, it is estimated that a bit in the north of 50% of the Turkish population are insured. It works in a way where the insurance companies are agents. So they sell the policy, they take their commission, and they all go to the pool, which is reinsured internationally. The basic compulsory limit today, by today's exchange rate, is $33,000 or 640,000 Turkish lira. And you can buy additional covers if you want. Oh, no. Sorry. It's not moving, but please can. All right. Morocco. You mentioned Morocco. The importance of Morocco is, as was mentioned by Chakib actually, the payment of the premium is divided into two. One of them goes to a fund, which is practically as a solidarity fund against catastrophic events for people who are not capable of buying an insurance policy, and part of it goes into the fund for the pool of the insurance policies that actually it's being reinsured afterwards. And what is also important here is that this is a mandatory extension on certain policies in Morocco. On motor, on property, and I was surprised to know that it's also on liability. So practically, liability policies have a mandatory extension, which means they are looking as well into the victims who are inside a certain premises and that you need to insure to it. And I think that's a very good example on the insurance, not only looking at the damages in terms of assets, but as well as the personal victims and individual victims, to have it included mandatory under the liability policy as well. Iran was mentioned, a different way of looking at it. All insurance companies, they have one pool with one reinsurer or insurance company managing it and placing it in the market. And this is a very typical, very well known in the market. It used to be over $1 billion, $1.2 billion of protection, which was also estimated to be on the low side, by the way, at the time. But also the problem was always the available of capacity, which we probably will tackle now. Three more slides. Less than 3 minutes. This is a slide where you see how we can deal a little bit about the exposures. So practically, question was asked about whether we did this for Jordan. You are going to see a few slides. We didn't mention the countries, but yes, one of them is Jordan, and these are, again, real figures aggregated for countries in the region. As you can see on the slides over there, we are talking about, let's take the first one. This is the retention results. This is the retention that the insurance companies are holding and protecting. If we look at the blue line is the possibility or probability of an event taking place. It shows very simply that there is a possibility, and the 260 million, this is the total protection purchased by the insurance companies for that market. What we're saying is that practically this country has bought an approximately around 700 years in terms of protection in their retention. The red one, however, is the possibility of that earthquake being off chart, is going over the averages of that we know under the normal probability, because the probability gives us whatever, a 95% possibility, but there's a 5% deviation of error, and that 5% deviation of error brings it down to less than 200 years, which shows that what happened now in Turkey is one of those off charts. Actually, it is considered to be around a 3,000-year event. And this is something that if happens today, most of the companies are not covered for. This is another country where we have done the same, again on real numbers. We can sit later with the Jordan market and discuss the Jordanian numbers, but I thought that for the purpose of this presentation, we shouldn't mention the numbers. The same thing, we see that always some kind of an underinsurance into protection if we take a certain deviation in one of the earthquakes that took place as in Turkey. Now, after we do this for a country, we stress test. The blue ones are stress testing where we did this for Turkey. Actually, this is for Istanbul area. This is real numbers for the current earthquake that took place. We took what happened now and we placed it near Istanbul, on the fort of Istanbul, and we stress test what it means for the companies if it happened near Istanbul. And I can tell you that the numbers really show that it could be disastrous if it would happen in Istanbul. Anything that we thought could be in a 500-year event would go down to by another 200 or 300 years and becomes a 200-year event, especially in terms of the financial losses that will come with it. We did the same for Izmir. I'm not going to go through this. The idea is that when we look at the pools, we look first at the country exposure, as we said. We stress test them for the different areas. And then we put every company A to company G, in blue is their own current protections. This is something that we are probably going to discuss or suggest later, that it could be one of the ideas that we can pick up maybe also as well in how to design a protection for the market. So the companies, each one buy according to their needs or board decisions, a 200 or 250-year return periods. And eventually, we can have the green one is another protection that be given over and above for the market level. So a parametric cover, it was mentioned before. One of the parametric covers works in a way that the reinsurer would pay a number as soon as an earthquake happens with a certain magnitude. So if, let's say, a magnitude of 7.5 happens, then the reinsurer, without asking about the claims numbers, whether it were paid or not or anything, there's a down payment that can be done immediately for a relief. So if we take this thought, which hasn't been present 100 years ago, but today is there, and we think about what we have today. So down, we have the conventional protection that we usually take, that we all know. We protect our protections, our retentions, for over, as I said, a pre-agreed number return periods, 200 or 250 years in this example. And then the market can sit together and agree, we would like to buy on a parametric basis what we consider to be a major peril, that the one like happened in Turkey, that actually killed the whole market in terms of protection and maybe even affect the even solvency of the insurance companies. We can translate what this 250 return period means into a magnitude of earthquake, if it is 7, for example, and we come and we buy for the whole market a protection for any earthquake that exceeds this magnitude, 7 in this example. The good thing about this solution as well is that the public sector can also be part of this cover. So the public sector can jump in and say, I would like also to have a $500 million protection, because this is where I'm going to need them for my infrastructure, for immediate relief to the people that today might be a little bit difficult to have from the current capabilities of the company. So thank you very much. We'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Dr. Mohammad. I think we had, honestly speaking, we had a very interesting presentation. I cannot say that I understand everything in the two presentations because I think with Dr. Mohammad, we need maybe a PhD in mathematics to understand. With Hassan, I think we need to be more than an underwriter to understand everything. I will open the floor to a few questions. دكتور مؤيد إذا بتسمح لي بدنا ناخذ 10 دقائق ربع ساعة يمكن نتأخر شوية لأن صراحة السيشن كانت ممتازة. ف any question أسئلة? Because I don't want to ask question. I have prepared my question. However, I want now the public to ask question. Please تفضل. الاسم لو سمحت والشركة والسؤال ولا مين موجه السؤال؟
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations, both of you. Thank you. My question is for Rajai Noursi, Delta Insurance. My question is for Hassan.
Slowly, please.
Sorry?
Slowly, بشوية.
Slowly, okay.
بتتكلم بسرعة كتير.
All right, okay. I've seen interesting model where you've applied higher deductibles and the impact that had on the total cost. Have you had the opportunity to model the implementation of a cap rather than a deductible? So something from the top down, like a 50% cap or another maybe an approach that's not just a deductible. So that's something, because increasing the deductible will certainly have a social element to it. That's my question. Thank you very much, and really interesting, both of you.
Thank you, Rajai. Yes, and I didn't mention it because that's something that we do very often, almost every time we model. When you model the numbers as they are taken, they represent the exposures of the policy. So if, let's say, if you have a policy of $1 million sum insured and you have a full earthquake to it, and then it is taken into the numbers of as a million. And then if you put a cap of $500,000, obviously we take the $500,000. I think what we need to mention over here, referring to your question, is that this cap is probably not as important, is definitely not as important as a deductible. Because when we are modeling the $1 million sum insured policy, it does not mean that we are going to pay the $1 million. It is very probable that we are going to pay a percentage of that because of the frequencies of the policies, the number of the policies that would be hit. So in all possibility, if all the policies, you put a cap of 50%, just as an assumption, you will not have the 50% exposure. You will stay very high, actually, in terms of the probabilities, probably even close to 80-85% anyway of the exposure. The deductible coming from down, which really means at the end of the day, maybe 2, 3, 4,000 in terms of 100,000 loss. This is where it makes really a difference because you are taking this certainly on each and every policy that takes place. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. Any other question? تفضل. بس يا ريت تعطيه المايك لو سمحتوا.
Thank you so much for the very impressive and interesting presentations. First of all, I think that we will get those presentations from the organizers. Actually, regarding the modeling, modeling is essential for such estimation or risk-based pricing. So, can you recommend a benchmark model so as to assess and discuss, or we can use it as a benchmark?
It's a very interesting question because let me answer it differently to say no. The answer is, if you take the same portfolio today, can you hear me? If you take the same portfolio today and you model it on 2 or 3 different models, Catrisk or Equicat or RMS, as was mentioned by Mohammad, you would not get same results. You would get different results because the inherent way of thinking inside the models are different. But it doesn't mean that one of them is correct or not. The idea behind the probabilistic approach that was mentioned is actually to get a standardized way of looking at your numbers as you go and assess what you have. I wouldn't personally recommend one. What I can say is that we need to look at what is more updated. the work behind the models is not only insurance, it's very much geological. And today, yes, I think that there are 3 or 4 in the market. I can mention 3 of them that I think are updated, so I wouldn't say they are more or less correct. I think there is actually my friend Mohammad Catrisk, he has one of the most updated in the region. There is CoreLogic, which they use EquiCat, and there is RMS. These, they work pretty much always on the update, and by update I mean where the plates are, what are the latest geological analysis that needs to be implemented to come with the numbers.
Dr. Mohammad.
Yeah, I think going back to your question, with regard to the model, we are limited to the current knowledge we have about the nature. So we are basically trying to capture whatever information we have on scientific level, turn it into a business model. So that's basically a cap. So we cannot, we wish we could actually do much better job, but that's what we limited. In terms of exposure data, which you mentioned, it's actually a very important issue because that's the area that we could make a lot of enhancement. We might not be able to make what we want to do enhancement on the model because we are limited with the limited data on nature, but with exposure is in our hand. We could actually capture more precise location, more precise, rather than actually facing with quite aggregate data, we could go into much more detailed sort of description of exposure. And I could tell you that as soon as you start to take the model-based approach for risk management, that actually improves. I could mention, for example, like say UAE. I was dealing with UAE exposure 5-6 years ago. I was sort of facing with very aggregate data by Dubai, by Ras Al Khaimah, and so on. But nowadays, I'm getting data precisely by longitude, latitude, because they see the achievement, they see basically what comes out of the model, and that message passes to the sort of seeding company. If you want to make a better assessment, give me better data. And they turn it into tools, application, capturing data. I believe as soon as you start to take the model approach, maybe not immediately, but years after, you start to receive better data from the market because they see. For fire, they don't need it. Fire doesn't matter location, but for earthquake, location become very important. Construction classes become very important. So I believe that will be an improvement in time as soon as you start to, maybe not at the moment, but that would improve, basically.
Last question, please. بس بليز إذا ممكن نخليه للناس. All the questions are important.
Who is responsible in the government or in the country to collect such data and to be as trusted source of data in the UAE experience?
I think the insurance company themselves. I believe there is no, because there are tools available. The technology, the GPS, the information that you could capture on the policy wording, I think that is already in place. I don't think that necessarily, maybe yes, on the national scale, if you want to do some pooling, that will be the government through the surveying, through the collecting sort of census data or other sort of information, they could do that. But I think on the commercial side, it goes back to the seeding company themselves to make that collection of data. I believe, so you could probably Hassan add to that if you
I think probably in our cases it's going to be a little bit difficult to move too very fast into the public census. Yeah. That's the dream. I think today if we can start with having more accurate portfolios from the insurance, where it's not only numbers that are a bit vague or not clear for everybody in terms of, but they are a little bit, they make sense. If we can move to more GPS kind of policy, we definitely would improve our portfolios, or we can start working to go further later on.
If you allow me, they will take 1 or 2 minutes with Dr. Mohammad. Is modeling very expensive? My question to you, because we are talking modeling now, I think there is a cost to pay for modeling. Is it very expensive?
I don't believe so with the other costs that the insurance sort of industry is dealing with. And the achievement and the added value that brings, I don't think it's expensive. Maybe, yes, I mean, traditionally with some main vendors, probably was a big sort of cost. But I believe nowadays there are so many other solutions that make it affordable, even to a small insurance company. People might not be able to actually model, to capture the model or license the model, but they could actually do it through consulting services. And we receive basically so many consulting service requirement, people send in their portfolio, we run it for them and send it back to them. So I don't think the price and the cost are going to be an issue here.
I have another controversial question. How much is the probability of accuracy of the models? I think this is something.
What do you call accurate then?
It's not 100% accuracy, but now, as we can see.
I think probably we call it reliability. I think reliability probably is a better word than accuracy, because in the probabilistic world, there is not such a thing as accurate. Because
a model is a model. Now, how accurate is a model? Honestly speaking,
I think how reliable is the model goes back what information goes into the model. And as I said, we are not saying that we could do magic, because we have to rely on whatever information scientifically is available. And then that basically depends region by region. For some region, we have very detailed information and sort of big history of events that we could actually turn it into probabilistic model. For some region, uncertainty high. We could say that both models are reliable within the range of uncertainty that you could accept. So that's my answer, perhaps, yeah.
If you allow me, I think we should put a recommendation to the Jordan Insurance Federation. I think we need at least 1 day or 2 days to talk specifically about the models. But what you have presented today, I think we need more than 1 day, honestly, to try to understand that. فدكتور مؤيد يظهر لي أنه إذا كان ممكن يكون فيه والله سيمينار أو في النكست. بعرف أن الموضوع حكينا فيه كثير، بس صدقوني يا جماعة الموضوع موضوع ساعة. لما شفنا شو صار ما بين سوريا وتركيا، للاسف الشديد سوريا ما كان في ميكانيزمات للتعويض الى اخره، في الوقت اللي على الاقل في تركيا كان في TCIP، ويمكن TCIP اذا فهمت انا من التقارير اللي قريتها او شيء بيدفع 3.5 مليار دولار او شيء من هذا القبيل. فبس في سوريا ما سمعنا شيء عن الموضوع هذا. فبيظهر لي اننا احنا بحاجه، سواء في الاردن، في فلسطين، في لبنان، في شمال افريقيا، محتاجين انه نفهم اكثر. لان اليوم في نخبه من الناس بتفهم الموديلينج، ولكن عموم الناس اللي بتشتغل في التأميم ما كثير مستوعبين الموضوع، بما فيهم العبد لله ماني مستوعب كمان كل الاشياء اللي بتقال. فانا بتمنى لو تكون يمكن في اطار المبادره العربيه، يمكن في اطار شيء ثاني، يكون شيء بيخص الكوارث الطبيعيه، لانه اليوم احنا بنحكي على موضوع حيوي، على موضوع مهم، مش حكي نتاع والله اللي كنا بنحكي فيه من زمان على الوعي التأميني والاشياء الهلاميه او الاشياء اللي كانت يمكن نظريه. لا، بدنا نحكي بالواقع. شو ما حكينا على الموضوع هذا منصور. فبعد اذنكم انا بدي اختتم الجلسه بشكر محمد، لانه صراحه انا I was impressed by your presentation. حسن كمان انا was really impressed، ومش مجامله مني، بس both presentation were very good. الاثنين صراحه كان لنا حظ اننا استمعنا اليهم. فمعكم جميعا بتشكرهم واتمنى نصفقوا لهم جميعا.
أدعو الدكتور مؤيد إلى الستيج لتكريم رئيس الجلسة والمتحدثين لهذه الجلسة. شكرا. وهلا